A famous judge known for his rigidity and bias harshly punished a black man simply for being late. When the man's identity was revealed, the judge couldn't hide his shock and confusion. What seemed like a simple case turned into a revelation of deep flaws and prejudice within the legal system. What would you do when faced with such an abuse of power? The clock on the dashboard displayed 8:42 a.m. when Darius Carter, a federal prosecutor, parked his car in the lot outside the Magnolia City Court. The bright morning sun cast long shadows of trees across the asphalt, but Darius couldn't relax. He hated being late, something his job, based on discipline and preparation, rarely allowed. Today, nothing was going according to plan. The issue at hand seemed simple: an objection to a real estate tax error involving the house his grandmother had left him. However, that house was more than just property, it was the heart of his childhood, where he learned right from wrong under the strict yet loving guidance of his grandmother. It had once been the site of community meetings she organized to fight social injustice in the neighborhood. For Darius, protecting this house was not just a legal obligation but also a way of honoring his grandmother's legacy. Darius looked every bit the experienced prosecutor he was, but this morning, nothing was going smoothly. An urgent call from his team about a human trafficking case had delayed him. He couldn't ignore the pressing matter, needing to review important documents before heading to Magnolia Court, cutting his travel time dangerously close. As he stepped up the courthouse stairs, his phone buzzed in his pocket. A message from a colleague appeared on the screen: "Be careful with Judge Irving Merrow. He's known for being tough, especially against black people." Darius sighed, slipping the phone into his briefcase. He wasn't too worried. Truth had always been his greatest weapon, and he came fully prepared. But the warning lingered in his mind, making the morning air feel heavier. He entered the cool hallway of Magnolia Court. Unlike the federal courts he was used to, this one had an old, somewhat dreary feel. The pale yellow walls, worn-out chairs, and the lingering smell of old paper and leftover coffee highlighted the fatigue of a place dealing with everyday minor cases. Darius checked the time: 8:55 a.m. He had 10 minutes to find his courtroom. His grandmother's house was waiting for him to protect it, but the challenges ahead might be much greater than he had anticipated. Darius stepped into courtroom 204, the old wooden door creaking softly as he pushed it open. The room's atmosphere made the passage of time feel almost tangible: the pale yellow walls faded with age, the rows of benches worn smooth from years of use, and the dim light from the fluorescent bulbs above. The air, though unspoken, carried a sense of both harshness and coldness. As Darius's gaze swept across the room, he immediately recognized Judge Irving Merrow. Tall, thin, with neatly combed silver hair, Merrow sat high on the bench like a god passing judgment on the fates below. He didn't need to say much, his presence alone commanded silence in the room. Merrow had once been an idealistic judge. In the early years of his career, he bravely fought against a corruption network in the local political system. However, his efforts not only failed but also made him a target of attacks, isolating him from colleagues and the powerful elites. Those years wore down his belief in justice. Instead, he turned to rigid discipline and absolute control as a way to protect himself from further harm. Now, the fire of Merrow's passion for fairness was gone. In its place were cold, cautious eyes tinged with bitterness. When he saw Darius walk in, his gaze flickered with a hint of irritation, an undercurrent of prejudice mixed with a fixation on power. Darius was not the first person Merrow felt he needed to teach a lesson. In Merrow's world, people like Darius, young, confident, and especially black, were often seen as those who failed to respect the rules. A soft throat clearing from the court clerk signaled that the hearing was about to begin. Irving Merrow quickly flipped through the documents in front of him. His movements were efficient but carried an unmistakable air of indifference. For Merrow, the cases in this city court were nothing more than routine procedures, places where he could impose his authority without anyone daring to challenge him. Darius sat in a row of seats at the back, his eyes carefully observing every gesture of the judge. It didn't take long for him to realize that Merrow was not just rigid but had been shaped by past failures into a symbol of injustice disguised under the guise of order. When Judge Merrow finally looked up again, his eyes landed on Darius. The look was a silent warning, but Darius only met it with calm. He knew that the real battle had just begun. The sharp strike of Judge Irving Merrow's gavel echoed through the courtroom, pulling the entire room back into silence. He cleared his throat, scanning the list of cases before stopping at the name Darius Carter. "Carter, Darius," he called, his dry voice ringing out like an order. Darius stood up, walking confidently but calmly up to the bench. He placed his briefcase on the table, adjusted his tie, and looked directly at Judge Merrow. But as soon as he opened his mouth to greet the judge, Merrow cut him off. "You're late," Merrow said, his tone icy, his gaze piercing through Darius, full of authority and reprimand. "Your Honor," Darius replied, maintaining a composed voice. "I sincerely apologize. I had to handle an urgent matter involving a federal human trafficking case. I hope you understand that." "There is no excuse for disrespecting the court's time," Merrow interrupted sharply, his voice like a blade cutting through the air. "Rules are rules. Your tardiness wastes not only my time but also the time of everyone else in this room." The courtroom fell silent. A few people glanced at Darius with looks of sympathy. Meanwhile, Court Clerk Ellie Sherman, who had become accustomed to Merrow's unjust decisions, squinted in displeasure but remained silent, her hands resting lightly on her keyboard. Across the room, Judge Florence Hatcher sat quietly. As Merrow's longtime colleague, she understood the harshness of his rulings. Florence watched the scene, unable to ignore the injustice, but she knew any protest from her would only make her the next target of Merrow's wrath. "You are fined $750 for contempt of court," Merrow declared, his tone final, as if there was nothing more to discuss. Darius took a deep breath, holding back the anger rising within him. He stared directly into Merrow's eyes, trying to stay calm. Darius spoke steadily, "Your Honor, I do not intend to disrespect the court. I only wish to explain my circumstances." "No excuses are accepted here, Carter," Merrow interrupted, his tone loaded with disdain. "Rules are rules. Learn to follow them, or leave this profession." Merrow's words carried a veiled insult, deliberately aiming to attack Darius's self-respect. The excessive fine and Merrow's harsh words created a stifling atmosphere in the courtroom. A few people lowered their heads, avoiding looking at Darius. Meanwhile, others, like Court Clerk Ellie Sherman, could only remain silent in their helplessness. As Darius returned to his seat, he overheard murmurs from the gallery. An elderly man whispered to his companion, "He never punishes white people like this. It's so unfair." But those words were quickly swallowed by silence as Merrow's gaze swept across the room. Judge Florence Hatcher remained motionless, her eyes cast downward, avoiding confrontation. Deep inside, however, she couldn't deny that what had just happened highlighted Merrow's bias, a truth she had witnessed too many times but never dared to speak out against. Darius opened his briefcase, pretending to focus on his notes, but in his mind, a different plan began to form. This was no longer just about him. It was about an entire system that had long enabled people like Irving Merrow. This battle was far from over. Darius sat down, trying to steady his breath after the tense confrontation with Judge Merrow. He opened his briefcase, pretending to skim through documents related to the tax case, but his mind kept drifting back to how Merrow had treated him. The sense of injustice lingered, but Darius didn't let his emotions overpower his rationality. Instead, he began to observe the proceedings in the courtroom more closely. Soon after, a white man entered the room, clearly in a hurry. He was just as late as Darius, if not later. Yet, there was no reprimand from Judge Merrow. Instead, Merrow simply nodded and allowed him to present his case immediately. Darius furrowed his brow, his eyes narrowing as they fixed on Merrow, who flipped through papers indifferently. Next, a young woman dressed in casual clothing entered, clearly unfamiliar with the courtroom atmosphere. She too was late and apologized, flustered, before sitting down. Merrow gave her a dismissive glance and simply reminded her, "Be mindful of the time next time," before moving on to the next case without another word. Darius could feel the discrepancy in the way people were treated. This was no coincidence. It was part of a pattern he had heard about but was now witnessing firsthand. His mind involuntarily drifted back to his college days when a classmate, Michael Sanders, shared his experience before Judge Merrow. Michael, also a black man, had been charged with a minor traffic violation. In the courtroom, Merrow not only fined Michael double the usual amount but also publicly mocked his job, saying, People like you need to learn to respect the rules. At the time, Darius had only been able to comfort his friend, but that story had always stayed with him. Now, sitting in this courtroom, everything was clearer than ever. This was not just an isolated incident of injustice, it was a systemic issue perpetuated by people like Merrow. Darius glanced briefly at Judge Florence Hatcher, who sat in the corner of the room. She remained silent, her eyes focused on the papers in front of her. But Darius couldn't help but notice the look of unease in her manner. Perhaps she saw what he saw, but for some reason, she chose to remain silent. Darius gripped his pen tightly, hurriedly jotting down his observations. He knew that what was happening today couldn't be forgotten. This was not just about him, it was about an entire system that hid its injustice behind the guise of discipline and power. And Darius had made up his mind, he would not stay silent like the others. He set the pen down, his gaze no longer focused on the notes in his briefcase. The observations he had made had only strengthened his resolve. The silence of the courtroom, the rustling of papers, and the cold fluorescent lighting only added to the heavy atmosphere. It was time for him to act. As the court moved on to the next case, Darius stood up and walked to the podium again, his eyes locked onto Judge Irving Merrow, who was flipping through his case files without looking up. Your Honor, Darius began, his voice calm yet full of weight, I believe it would be helpful if I properly introduce myself. I am Darius Carter, a federal prosecutor from the Northern District of North Carolina. I have served in the federal judiciary for over a decade, focusing on cases involving human trafficking, corruption, and civil rights violations. Merrow looked up, his cold blue eyes staring hard at Darius. There was a brief flicker of doubt, but he quickly masked it with a stern demeanor. I fail to see how that is relevant to this case, Carter, he responded, his voice more rigid than usual. Your Honor, Darius continued unwaveringly, I'm not just here to address a personal issue regarding property tax. I also cannot ignore what I witnessed this morning. The way you've handled cases here, particularly those involving late arrivals, seems inconsistent. I have to ask, are the rules being applied equally to everyone in this courtroom? The tension in the room became palpable. Whispers rippled through the audience. Some eyes nervously turned to Judge Merrow, while others, including Rosa Hart, an elderly woman sitting in the front row, looked at Darius with an expression full of empathy. Her gaze seemed to say, finally, someone is speaking out. Merrow furrowed his brow, a rare look of discomfort crossing his face. He lightly tapped his fingers on the table, a habit that Darius quickly recognized as a sign of agitation. But Merrow didn't reveal more. Carter, you're risking going too far, Merrow said, his voice low and threatening. If you want to accuse me of unfairness, I won't hesitate to increase the penalty. This is not your federal courtroom. Here, I set the rules. That threat didn't make Darius flinch. He lifted his head high, his gaze steady. Your Honor, I'm not accusing anyone. I'm simply asking a question because I believe the principle of fairness should be upheld in any courtroom, whether federal or city level. What I'm asking is, are you sure that everyone in this room is being treated equally? Merrow narrowed his eyes, his lips pressed tight. Perhaps for the first time in years, he was confronted with such a direct challenge. He opened his mouth to speak, but just then, Rosa Hart softly cleared her throat. Every eye in the room turned toward her. She sat still, her eyes filled with meaning as they locked onto Darius, offering silent support. Enough! Merrow finally interjected, striking his gavel hard against the bench. I will not allow this courtroom to turn into a personal platform. Return to your seat, Carter. We are continuing with the proceedings. Darius nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Merrow's. He returned to his seat, but he didn't feel defeated. On the contrary, Merrow's fleeting discomfort and loss of control only confirmed to Darius that he had struck a nerve. A larger battle lay ahead, and Darius was ready for it. As the session adjourned, Darius left the courtroom with a composed exterior, but inside, a storm of anger and determination churned. The image of Judge Irving Merrow, authoritative yet momentarily shaken when challenged, lingered in his mind. Darius knew that what he had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident. It was indicative of a deeper systemic issue that needed uncovering. Back in his office at the federal courthouse, Darius began drafting a report to the prosecutor's office and judicial oversight organizations. He detailed the events of the morning meticulously, noting each act of injustice he had observed in the courtroom. However, to spark an official investigation, he needed more evidence, irrefutable data to expose the biased patterns that Merrow was enforcing. Darius thought of Ellie Sherman, Merrow's courtroom clerk, whose discomfort during the proceedings had been evident. One afternoon, he visited Ellie in her small, cluttered office. She sat behind an old wooden desk typing on her keyboard but stopped when she saw Darius enter. Her cautious eyes met his. "Mr. Carter," Ellie said, her voice quiet but steady. "What can I do for you?" "Ellie," Darius began, his tone gentle but firm, "I need your help. What's happening in Judge Merrow's courtroom cannot be ignored. I believe you've seen things others haven't noticed, and I think you feel as I do, that something isn't right." Ellie stared at him, her eyes betraying her anxiety. "I'm just a clerk," she said softly, as if trying to convince herself of her insignificance. "But you're there every day," Darius replied. "You know how he handles cases, and I need the truth, not just for me, but for everyone who's been treated unfairly in that room." Ellie took a deep breath, her gaze falling to her desk. A long silence passed before she opened a drawer and pulled out an old notebook. "I don't know if this will help you," she said, her voice trembling, "but I've been keeping these notes for years. I couldn't stand the way he treated certain people, so I started writing it all down." Darius accepted the notebook and quickly flipped through its pages. Inside, Ellie had meticulously recorded dates, defendants' names, and clear examples of bias in Merrow's rulings. The notes were a treasure trove of information, exposing not only racial prejudice but also Merrow's harsh treatment of vulnerable defendants. "Ellie, you don't know how important this is," Darius said, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you for your courage." Ellie nodded, but the worry was still etched on her face. "Be careful, Mr. Carter," she said. "Judge Merrow isn't someone who can be easily brought down. His influence runs deeper than you think." That evening at the federal prosecutor's office, Darius shared his plans with Sean Blake, a longtime colleague and friend. But Sean's reaction wasn't what Darius had hoped. "Darius, I understand your anger," Sean said, his voice low but firm. "But you're putting yourself in danger. Merrow isn't just a city judge, he has deep connections. Any investigation into him will draw a lot of enemies." "Sean, I can't sit back," Darius countered. "We're prosecutors. Our job is to uphold justice, not ignore wrongdoing." "True, but our job is also to survive in this system. You need to understand that sometimes fighting doesn't achieve anything but self-destruction," Sean replied, his gaze bearing into Darius as though urging him to reconsider. Sean's words only strengthened Darius's resolve. He stood, meeting Sean's eyes. "If this system can't exist without injustice, maybe it's not worth protecting. I'm doing this, Sean, whatever the cost." Sean sighed and shook his head. "Just remember, not everyone will stand with you." With Ellie's notebook in hand and an unshakable determination, Darius dove deeper into his research. Late into the nights, he compared the judgments in the notebook with Magnolia Court's public records, uncovering an undeniable pattern. Black defendants, particularly, received significantly harsher penalties than white defendants for similar offenses. Requests for leniency, like payment plans, were frequently denied for black defendants, while white defendants had their requests granted with little to no scrutiny. Ellie Sherman's notebook not only provided crucial evidence but also served as the key to unlocking a much larger door. Darius began gathering more data, delving deeper into the cases presided over by Judge Irving Merrow. As the pieces of the larger picture began to take shape, he realized he was facing a far greater issue, one that wasn't just about individual injustice but a pattern of bias that had persisted for decades. But his efforts didn't stop within the confines of his office. One day, after receiving the notebook from Ellie, Darius shared his story with a friend, Na Alvarez, a passionate law student who was always eager to fight for justice. After hearing his account, Na offered to write about what had transpired. With her sharp writing skills and insightful perspective, Na created a detailed article. She described the events in the Magnolia courtroom, from how Darius had been severely penalized for being late to the indifferent attitude Merrow showed toward others who committed similar offenses. Na didn't shy away from criticizing the bias and injustice in the judge's handling of cases. She called on the community to speak out. The article was published on her blog and quickly gained traction. Within hours, thousands of shares and comments flooded in. People who had experienced similar injustices began to share their stories in the comments section. One person wrote, "I was fined 3 times more than someone else simply because I'm black. This isn't a coincidence." A new hashtag #JusticeInMagnolia, quickly became a trending topic on social media, drawing the attention of journalists and human rights organizations. As the story spread, public outrage began to boil over. Residents, many of whom had been victims in Merrow's courtroom, saw this as their chance to be heard. Lively discussions took place on social media and in small coffee shops around Magnolia. A grassroots group even organized a gathering at a park near the courthouse to share experiences and call for action. News of Na's article quickly caught the attention of major media outlets. Journalists began reaching out to Darius for interviews to clarify the story, but he declined, focusing solely on his investigation. He knew that what mattered wasn't appearing in the media but ensuring his evidence was strong enough to hold Merrow accountable. However, as the story gained more attention, Darius realized not everyone wanted to see justice served. One evening, as he worked late in his office, his phone buzzed with an anonymous message, "Give up now if you don't want to regret it. Merrow is not someone you can defeat." Darius stared at the screen, feeling the coldness in every word. But instead of discouraging him, the message only fueled his determination. "If they feel the need to threaten me," he thought, "it means I'm on the right track." Darius knew this battle wasn't just about Merrow, it was a confrontation with a system that had enabled and protected injustice for far too long. The anonymous threat did not deter Darius. On the contrary, it pushed him to accelerate his investigation. With the support of Ellie Sherman's notebook, Darius and his team at the prosecutor's office began digging deeper into Judge Irving Merrow's trial records over the past decade. The numbers began to speak for themselves, and they didn't lie. Black defendants were routinely handed sentences 3 times harsher than their white counterparts for similar offenses. Even requests for leniency, such as payment plans, were frequently denied for black defendants, while white defendants had their requests accepted with little to no scrutiny. These findings only strengthened Darius's resolve. But he knew that the data alone wouldn't tell the full story. He needed testimony from those who had worked directly with Merrow to add weight to the investigation. In the days that followed, Darius approached Judge Florence Hatcher, a longtime colleague of Merrow. Florence was a small but sharp woman with neatly styled silver hair. She had been present in the courtroom that day and had witnessed the entire event, yet she had said nothing. Initially, Florence seemed reluctant when Darius met her in her office. "I've worked with Irving for too long," she said, her voice low and hesitant. "He has his way of doing things, and I'm not sure I can interfere." Darius leaned forward, his gaze firm. "Judge Hatcher, I understand the pressure you've been under. But what's happening here is not just a personal issue. It has become a system of injustice that people rely on to oppress the vulnerable. We cannot remain silent any longer." Florence sat in silence for a long moment, her gaze distant. She thought back to the times when Merrow had imposed his will on her and the cases where she was forced to handle matters in ways she knew were wrong. Finally, she sighed, as though shedding part of the burden. "I will do what's right," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I will testify." Alongside Florence's promise, Darius's team discovered an old, forgotten file in the court archives. It was a case involving a major real estate developer who had been charged with fraud. Judge Merrow had inexplicably handed down a lenient sentence, allowing the defendant to pay a token fine. What stood out was that, according to the records, the defendant's lawyers had had a private meeting with Merrow a few days before the trial. The file didn't directly accuse anyone, but notes from a former clerk suggested that a bribe had been involved. This discovery made Darius realize that Merrow's injustices weren't just limited to racial bias but also hinted at corruption. It wasn't merely a matter of professional ethics, it was a well-hidden systemic crime. In a meeting with his investigative team, Florence Hatcher officially provided her testimony. She recounted how Merrow often imposed his will on fellow judges and forced them to comply with his decisions. He would always say we needed to maintain order, Florence said, but the truth is, his decisions were always based more on bias than the law. Florence's testimony, coupled with the evidence Darius had gathered, quickly became the foundation for an official investigation by the Judicial Oversight Committee. Darius knew this was just the beginning, but for the first time, he felt that the truth was on his side. News of the investigation quickly spread through the Magnolia legal community. Merrow still maintained his outward calm, but signs of tension began to show. In court, he became increasingly irritable, trying to maintain absolute control. Darius couldn't help but notice that the powerful judge was beginning to waver. His game is coming to an end, Darius thought, his gaze steely. But he also knew that, like anyone confronting entrenched power, the battle ahead would not be easy. The room for the public hearing was packed. The harsh white light from the fluorescent bulbs reflected off the polished wooden tables, creating a solemn yet stifling atmosphere. The whispers grew quieter as Judge Irving Merrow entered. His usual calm demeanor remained intact, but his eyes betrayed a rare sense of unease. This was no ordinary hearing. For the first time in his 3-decade-long career, it was Merrow who had to face judgment. Darius Carter sat straight-backed in the front row reserved for prosecutors, his gaze never leaving the judge who had once unjustly sentenced him. In front of him was a thick stack of files containing irrefutable evidence, each piece pointing to one undeniable truth: Merrow's power had not been used to protect justice but to reinforce bias and sustain injustice. Beside Darius sat Florence Hatcher and Ellie Sherman, their faces reflecting determination. This was not just Darius's fight. This was the moment when the entire Magnolia legal system was placed on trial. The room fell into a deeper silence when the chairperson of the committee declared the hearing open. Her authoritative voice rang out. Judge Irving Merrow, you are summoned today to answer questions related to your conduct and decisions in the Magnolia courtroom. This hearing aims to determine whether your actions have violated the principles of fair justice. Merrow rose, his imposing figure a remnant of the authority he once wielded. I have served in this judicial system for over 3 decades, he began, his voice slow and deliberate. I have always worked with the singular goal of maintaining order and the dignity of the law. My decisions have not always been popular, but I believe they were made with responsibility and reason. His tone carried a hint of pride, yet it could not hide the tension in his eyes. Merrow scanned the room, attempting to catch a sympathetic glance, but all he encountered were cold or scrutinizing stares. This was no longer the courtroom where he had once reigned supreme. It was a place where he had to answer for his actions. Darius stood when granted permission to speak, his gaze briefly resting on Merrow before sweeping across the room. The air seemed to freeze. Everyone, from the oversight committee to the onlookers, was focused on the man holding the thick stack of files in his hand. He walked confidently to the podium, his calm demeanor radiating undeniable authority. Honorable committee, Darius began, his voice echoing in the stillness of the room, we are not here today to hear about Judge Merrow's years of service or the justifications for his decisions. We are here to ask one crucial question: has the power he wielded been used to uphold justice, or has it been abused to perpetuate injustice? Darius paused, his eyes scanning each member of the committee. Today is not about an individual. Today is about how our justice system has failed the very people who need it most. Darius slowly opened the file, each movement adding to the tension in the room. He pulled out the first few pages and carefully placed them on the podium. Over the past 10 years, he continued, his voice becoming sharper, the data we've gathered shows the average sentence for black defendants in Judge Merrow's courtroom is 3 times harsher than for white defendants in similar cases. He raised a chart, the numbers illustrated by brightly colored bars. Each bar seemed to pierce the veneer of Merrow's authority. Not only that, Darius added, his voice growing heavier, but black defendants have been denied requests for leniency, such as payment plans, at more than twice the rate of white defendants. This is no coincidence. This is a pattern of systemic bias. Darius stepped closer, his eyes alight with determination. These numbers do not lie. They are not subjective feelings or guesses. They are facts, and these facts paint a clear picture. Judge Merrow's power has not been used to protect justice. It has been used to protect prejudice. Merrow, sitting in his chair, could no longer mask the tremor in his eyes. He tapped his fingers lightly on the wooden desk, a habit Darius recognized from his early encounters with the judge. But this time, the sound wasn't a mark of authority, it was the sound of a man searching for an escape. "I've been doing this for 30 years, Marrow said, his voice lower now, as if struggling to hold on to some semblance of confidence. "I've always tried to do what was best to maintain order in my courtroom. If there have been mistakes, they were unintentional, not deliberate." Darius didn't let that excuse pass. "Unintentional mistakes," he repeated, his voice sharp like a knife. "Judge Marrow, when these unintentional mistakes happen repeatedly over a decade and always target the same group of people, that's no longer a mistake, that's a system." He turned to the Oversight Committee, his voice growing stronger. "What we're talking about here isn't just numbers on paper. This is about lives that have been ruined, families that have been torn apart, and a trust in our justice system that has been shattered. Judge Marrow's decisions haven't just been rulings, they've been verdicts on entire communities." Darius stepped closer to Marrow, his gaze cutting through the last of the judge's defenses. "Judge Marrow, can you look into the eyes of those sitting here, those who have suffered from the injustice of your rulings, and honestly say that you didn't know what was happening in your courtroom?" Marrow pressed his lips together, his hand trembling as he reached for his pen. I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes avoiding the truth. "Maybe I didn't realize." Darius didn't let that weak defense slide. "Didn't realize," he emphasized, his voice now thundering. "You had 30 years to realize, but you did nothing. And because of your silence, hundreds, even thousands, have paid the price." The room seemed to freeze. Every gaze, every breath was fixed on Marrow. A committee member, her voice firm and stern, broke the silence. "Judge Marrow, do you deny that your rulings have been biased?" For the first time, Marrow didn't answer immediately. He bowed his head, as if the weight of that question was too much to bear. I was wrong," he whispered, his words barely audible, but each word rang out in the room like an irreversible confession. Darius stood tall, his eyes burning with resolve. "You were wrong," he repeated, his voice slow but heavy with impact. "And your mistake is not just the mistake of an individual, it is a sign of a system that needs to be changed. You owe more than just an apology. You owe justice, the very justice you've denied so many." The room erupted in hushed murmurs, as if everyone had been allowed to breathe after a long period of silence. Yet within those murmurs, there was a clear stirring of anger and determination. Just days after the public hearing, an official announcement was released by the Magnolia City Court's office. Judge Irving Marrow had submitted his resignation. The statement provided no detailed explanation, but everyone knew the reason. Darius received the news while at his office. He neither celebrated nor felt comfortable. To him, Marrow's resignation was just the first step. "His resignation doesn't fix the wrongs this system has caused," Darius muttered to himself. "We need real change." Under pressure from public opinion and human rights organizations, a series of reforms were implemented at the Magnolia Courthouse. The court leadership pledged to adopt new measures to ensure fairness. One of the most significant changes was the appointment of Ellie Sherman as the court's new oversight officer. With her experience and proven courage, Ellie took the helm of an independent committee tasked with reviewing and monitoring all court decisions to prevent any future bias. At her swearing-in ceremony, Ellie stood before the court staff, her voice trembling but resolute. "I once thought silence was the only way to survive," she said. "But now I understand that silence doesn't change anything. Justice can't truly exist if we don't fight for it every day." Additionally, a mandatory ongoing training program on bias awareness and fairness was implemented, requiring all judges and court staff to participate. The court system was also digitized, allowing data on cases and judicial decisions to be publicly accessible for everyone to monitor. The Magnolia community wasn't passive either. Rosa Hart, the elderly woman who had witnessed Darius's case, organized a community meeting at her small church. It wasn't just a gathering to thank Darius, but a call to action. "We've seen what happens when one person dares to stand up," Rosa said before the crowd, her voice trembling with emotion. "But Darius couldn't do it alone. We must become the voices to stop injustice from continuing. This is our time to unite." The meeting drew hundreds of residents, from those who had suffered injustice to young people hungry for change. Darius was there too, quietly standing in the back. He didn't want to be the center of attention. But when Rosa invited him to speak, he couldn't decline. "What we've achieved isn't just my victory," Darius said, his voice warm and sincere. "It's the victory of all of us, those who dared to speak up and refused to accept injustice. But remember, this is just the beginning. Justice is a long journey, and we must walk it together." As the meeting came to a close, Darius stood outside the church, witnessing the change in the eyes of those around him. It wasn't just hope, it was resolve. Magnolia was no longer a place that silently accepted injustice. Ellie Sherman stepped out of the church and approached Darius, offering him a gentle smile. "You've done what I once thought was impossible," she said. "We did it together," Darius replied, his eyes filled with gratitude. "And we'll keep going." From that moment on, the Magnolia Court not only changed in terms of policy but also in spirit. Those who had worked under Merrow's rule now felt freer to carry out their responsibilities with fairness. Cases were handled with more care, and the people of the city began to feel that their voices were being heard. The image of Darius, Rosa, and Ellie became a symbol of the power of unity between the community and the justice system. Magnolia was no longer a place where biased decisions were made in silence. It had become a beacon of hope and justice. Darius knew that the journey ahead was still long, but he believed Magnolia had taken the right first step. He thought to himself, not just for us, but for future generations. Magnolia had changed, but the echoes of the struggle reached far beyond the limits of the small town. The name Darius Carter began to appear in news articles, legal bulletins, and forums. What he had done wasn't just a victory in Magnolia, it became a powerful reminder that true justice requires the courage to confront deeply hidden injustices. One morning, while working in his office, Darius received an email from a professor at a prestigious law school. "We would like to invite you to teach a special course on professional ethics and fairness in the legal system," the email read. The professor explained that the school was looking for someone who could bring practical experience and inspiration to the next generation of young lawyers. Darius read the letter several times, a mixture of surprise and pride filling him. He agreed, and in the months that followed, Darius began teaching at law schools across the country. He shared his story, not just the successes, but also the struggles, the loneliness, and the moments when he had to face his fears. "Professional ethics is not a distant concept," he said during one lecture. "It's something you will fight for every day, even if it costs you dearly." One late evening, while checking his email, Darius discovered a short but emotional letter from a young law student in another state. The letter read, "Dear Mr. Carter, I am a second-year student at the University of Texas Law School. I once felt lost and doubted whether I could make a difference in the legal field. But after reading about your story, I realized why I chose this path. You made me believe that the law is not just rules, it's how we protect people and what is right. Thank you for standing up when others didn't." Asterisk. Darius sat quietly, his eyes momentarily filled with emotion. The letter reminded him that all the sacrifices and hardships had been worth it. In his modest office, Darius hung a special frame on the wall. Inside was the $750 fine receipt that Judge Merrow had imposed on him that fateful day. For others, it might have been a worthless piece of paper, but for Darius, it was a symbol of a beginning, a reminder that any injustice, no matter how small or large, must always be confronted with courage. Beneath the receipt, he wrote a simple message by hand. "Justice does not come from silence." Asterisk. Darius didn't just teach the law, he told stories. In every lecture, he painted a picture of the legal system, not just the dry clauses in textbooks but a living system that directly impacts people and communities. He shared his experiences, from facing Judge Irving Merrow to the sleepless nights spent analyzing data and the feeling of victory when justice was served. His stories weren't just meant to impart knowledge, they were reminders to his students that the law is the most powerful tool to change the world, but it only matters when used correctly.